Hi, Hope City. My name is Jason, and it's a pleasure for me to be here today with you to share what God is doing in our hearts and in our nation as we explore the topic of repentance and racial reconciliation together as a church.
Hi, Hope City. My name is Connie, and we are super excited to be invited by Phil and Andrew to share specifically about the topic of Canadian First Nations and participating in the work of justice. It is an area that is close to our families' hearts.
It has been an eye opening journey this summer to learn from Charles Dates, Phil Visor, Tim Keller, Mark Charles, and Christina Cleveland on various important topics related to the Black church, systemic injustice, corporate evil and race, trauma, and the doctrine of discovery. We have appreciated the thoughtfully chosen videos and discussion questions, which have really challenged us to examine our hearts and our lives. Up to this point, the talks have mainly been given from a US perspective, so we will try to bring this topic closer to home. We will touch mainly on Canadian history and the injustices perpetuated upon the First Nations people.
I know that for our micro church, we have had a lot of rich discussions over the past few months, and it's been a humbling experience as we pause to listen, learn, and reflect. We have been challenged to examine our own biases and ask God to reveal to us what our response should be now that we know more. We have been praying for God to soften our hearts and fill it with compassion and love for our neighbors and for our nation.
So today, over the next 20 minutes or so, we'll be following this outline. We don't present this information as experts in this field by any means, but we want to share how God has been journeying and teaching us as we make ourselves available for His work.
We'll first give a personal introduction and then share about our involvement with the Newhawk First Nations community in Belakula. Belakula is a breathtaking valley which is about 5 hours north of Williams Lake in British Columbia. After serving 4 summers in Belakula, God truly enriched us as a family, and we saw our faith grow deeper as we learned and are still learning to align our hearts to God's heart. God has opened our eyes and hearts to a beautiful community, sadly caught in a systemic injustices and living in the pain caused by various decades of mistreatment of Indigenous people. We heard firsthand stories of their past, their struggles, and even in some cases, their testimonies of God's goodness. We are so grateful that they welcomed us into their lives and onto their beautiful reserve land.
Next, we will share at a very high level the First Nations history, worldview, and culture in Canada. Lastly, we'll wrap up with how we, as a church, can participate in the works of justice for the First Nations people.
Here's a recent photo of our family during our memorable time in Parksville this summer. Jason and I have been married for almost 12 years. We have 3 kids: Kayla, who is 10, Jordan, who is 7, and Carissa, who is 3. Kayla is our bookworm, and Jordan loves Lego and sports, and Carissa enjoys dancing and singing. It's been somewhat of a whirlwind and unusual year, as you can imagine. Our pace of life has slowed down significantly, and our kids have spent most of their summer in mommy's summer camp, as most of our normal activities are on hold due to COVID. Outside the home, I'm a chartered accountant and currently working as a finance consultant. Our family started attending Hope City Church at the start of 2020, but unfortunately, with most of that time in quarantine due to COVID. We look forward to meeting and seeing all of you face to face one day, and truly miss gathering together as a congregation to worship.
As for myself, I'm a computer engineer by trade, and also just finishing up my Master's of Arts in Leadership, Theology, and Society at Regent this fall. It has been a long road, but God has been good, and as this opportunity to study has expanded my worldview to new perspectives, new opinions, new people, and I've really been humbled by what I do not know. I've also been challenged to be more engaged with our culture, and the past few years have given me space to reflect on how to live a seamless life where my personal faith is actively engaged with the world around me. The last few years has challenged us to go out of our own comfort zone and see how God is moving and working in communities different than our own.
Our journey with the First Nations community started almost 10 years ago when our small group was praying for God to show us how to put our faith in action. What was God requiring of us? We sensed God calling us not only to grow in knowledge, but to respond actively instead of passively. At the same time, Jason and I were discussing how we wanted to raise our young family, and our desire was to raise children who would be compassionate people and who would walk with the vulnerable, just as Jesus did. We concluded that we had to lead by example, as our children would watch us and imitate all that we do. The verse from Micah 6:8 was a key verse to us as it connects our faith with our action. Because of what God has done, we can respond by participating in healing the world around us through mercy and justice. We wanted to practically live out how to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God.
Recognizing that we didn't have to travel too far to participate in cross cultural outreach, God orchestrated us to be able to travel with a team in the summer of 2013 to visit Belakula. Belakula is on the central coast of BC, approximately 14 hours northwest of Vancouver. It is the ancestral territory of the Newhawk Nation, an extremely friendly, hospitable, and talented community with the hereditary chief being a Christian himself. The population of the Belakula Valley is approximately 2,000, with a large part of the population being children and elderly, as the working age group often leave the cities for work. Over the next 4 subsequent years, our family would make the trip up to visit Belakula to spend time with them, serving them, and responding to their unique needs each year.
Interestingly enough, the fact that we brought our children and the fact that we were Chinese was actually very well received. The New Hawk people loved children and was automatically drawn to our team. And being Chinese gave us an opportunity to share cultures and ideas in a very non threatening way. During our week long trips to Belakula, we received the chief's blessings to hold events such as family carnivals, community coffee house, kids VBS programs, host Sunday services, and outreach to the youth through events such as basketball tournaments. We had the privilege of doing prayer walks, very much like the ones we are doing as a church right now. We did home visits and even mow people's lawns and helped the elderly pick cherries from their trees. Our children worked alongside us, seeing firsthand what life was like on the reserves and making valuable friendships, as most children can so easily do. God taught us that if we are willing and available, He will provide generously in every way. The community needed much prayer for their generation of teens who experienced high suicide and pregnancy rates.
God continued to teach us that loving our neighbors was not a one-time act of kindness, but rather a lifelong posture and commitment to seeing people through God's eyes. We continually pray for God to break our hearts for what breaks His. We continue to visit with our New Hawk friends when they visit Vancouver, mainly for medical appointments, and mourn with them when members of the community experience tragedy or death, which has been quite frequent over the last few years. Just last month, a good friend living in Belakula passed away due to a heart attack and medical complications, which is not uncommon in the community. As fruits and vegetables are not readily available and often very expensive in the valley, unhealthy diets cause many health issues.
We're disappointed not to be able to go to Belakula this year due to COVID after many months of planning. Please keep this community in your prayers, especially during this pandemic, as a vulnerable elderly community and not as extensive healthcare as we receive here in Metro Vancouver. We'd be happy to share more stories with you in the future.
Now, since the most significant racial issue in Canada is probably related to the Canadian First Nations people, I'd like to share a little bit about Canadian First Nations history. So first, we'll start off talking about some terms and meanings, and the slide leverages the UBC Indigenous Foundation for these definitions. So Indigenous is a term used to encompass a variety of Aboriginal groups. It's most frequently used in an international, transnational, or global context. Countries will use slightly different terms for describing the original inhabitants of a country. In Canada, the term Aboriginal refers to the first inhabitants and includes First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. As an aside, you may know that Australia also uses the term Aboriginal, while the United States prefers the term Native American instead. First Nations is a term used to describe Aboriginal peoples of Canada who are ethnically neither Métis nor Inuit. The Métis are Aboriginal people who trace their ancestry to the plains of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. The Inuit are Aboriginal people who live in northern Canada, most notably in Nunavut, which, as you may know, is the latest Canadian province that was created after a land claims agreement was settled with the Inuit. In British Columbia, the Aboriginal people you encounter would most likely be First Nations. The term Indian refers to the legal identity of a First Nations person who is registered under the Indian Act. The term Indian should be used only when referring to a First Nations person with status under the Indian Act, and only within its legal context because it is a technical term. Now, looking back at history, the Dominion of Canada was confederated in 1867, and the relationship between the Indigenous people of Canada and the Canadian government has a long and tumultuous history. In 1876, the Dominion of Canada passed the Indian Act, which was a federal law which generally rests on the principle that the Aborigines are to be kept in a condition of tutelage and treated as wards or children of the state. Now, being a federal law, it was a sweeping legislation that applied to numerous people and communities across Canada. However, governing First Nations people at the federal level meant that provincial and municipal levels of government would not be providing their typical services. For example, education is managed at the provincial level, and water is managed at the municipal level. So this federal legislation would have significant future impact on the quality of life in these communities. In being wards of the state, it implies a certain hierarchy, with the government promising to care for the First Nations people as a parent cares for their children. The Prime Minister of Canada, John A. Macdonald, in 1887, said that the great aim of our legislation has been to do away with the tribal system and assimilate the Indian people in all respects with the other inhabitants of the Dominion as speedily as they are fit to change. This quote effectively captures some of the government leadership thinking in the 19th century. The phrase "our legislation" is not an inclusive statement because the legislation was established solely by those in the Canadian government without feedback from the First Nations people. Therefore, there is inherently an imbalance in power, where those making the laws have complete authority over those whom the law abides over. There is an underlying thinking of a us versus them mentality, and begins a segregation of races, which between the Indian and non-Indian people living in Canada. Furthermore, the great aim of the legislation is to eliminate the First Nations culture and assimilate them into the European-centric society. Those in power assume their culture is superior based on their own metrics, and this proves to be quite damaging to the cultures of First Nations people. Finally, MacDonald's comment has paradoxical thoughts of segregation and assimilation in the same sentence. On one hand, the Indian Act contains special legislation that applies only to First Nations people in order to separate them from other inhabitants of the Dominion. On the other hand, the ultimate goal is assimilation, and therefore a single society without Indian and non-Indian status. Now, whereas American slavery ended with the Emancipation Proclamation, which was ratified in 1865 after the American Civil War, the Indian Act in Canada still remains in effect today. This legislation granted the state significant power to govern matters pertaining to Indian status and lifestyle. Bob Joseph is an Indigenous person who wrote a book called 21 Things You May Not Have Known About the Indian Act, and it lists examples such as creating reserves and establishing residential schools, which we'll talk about more in detail later, and many additional parts, including creating an Indian status, which is a form of segregation, imposing the band council system, that's why there's a hereditary chief and an elected chief of the Newhawk people, and renaming individuals with European names. So, for example, Bob Joseph himself, that's a European name rather than an indigenous name. According to the Indian Act, reserves were held by Her Majesty for the use and benefit of the respective bands for which they were set apart. The wording is interesting because while the reserved land is set aside for the benefit of the band, the reserves are held by Her Majesty, meaning that the bands do not own the reserve. In other words, the reserve was held in trust by the Crown because of the paternalistic aspect of the Indian Act, and therefore the Crown had authority to dictate life on the reserve. In theory, reserves were created to segregate Indians until they were ready for assimilation. Once assimilated or enfranchised, Indians were to move off the reserve into regular society and lose Indian status. Indian status could also be lost in several ways, such as when an Indian woman married a non-Indian man, when an Indian went to university, or when an Indian joined the army. Loss of status meant that the person could no longer live on the reserve and would be cut off from his heritage, family, friends, and social network. Those living on the reserve had to obey the rules imposed by the government, such as having to request permission to leave the reserve, not forming political parties, and abiding by restrictions on sale of goods from the land. In British Columbia, the ratio for designating land to a band was an average of 20 acres granted per family and is one of the lowest ratios in Canada. If you go to the Belakula Valley, you will notice that the reserve is relatively small, just a few blocks in size, while the surrounding land in the valley is either crown or private land. While the reserves were intended to originally segregate Indians for the future goal of enfranchisement, The isolation of bands had the opposite effect of assimilation. Rather, people living on the reserves were able to live in community, hold on to the remnants of their culture, and collectively resist the government. However, due to the economic restrictions of the reserves, the majority of the First Nations bands are living in poverty, and some have likened the conditions to living in third world countries. In 1886, residential schools became part of the Indian Act, and they were perhaps the most aggressive and destructive of all Indian Act policies, according to Bob Joseph's book. Residential schools were originally created as an optional school system that Indians could send their children to in order to obtain a European centric education. When attendance in residential schools was deemed to be too low, the policies became more aggressive until residential schools became mandatory for Indian children in 1920. The mandatory legislation of detaching children from their native culture and keeping them constantly under foreign cultural conditions seems appalling to us today, but was an acceptable course of action in the 19th century. In 2008, Prime Minister Stephen Harper formally apologized for residential schools by saying, I quote, Mr. Speaker, I stand before you today to offer an apology to former students of Indian residential schools. The treatment of children in Indian residential schools is a sad chapter in our history. In the 1870s, the federal government, partly in order to meet its obligation to educate Aboriginal children, began to play a role in the development and administration of these schools. Two primary objectives of the residential school system were to remove and isolate children from the influence of their homes, families, traditions, and cultures, and to assimilate them into the dominant culture. These objectives were based on the assumption Aboriginal cultures and spiritual beliefs were inferior and unequal. Indeed, some sought, as it was infamously said, to kill the Indian in the child. Today we recognize that this policy of assimilation was wrong, has caused great harm, and has no place in our country. Most schools were operated as joint ventures with Anglican, Catholic, Presbyterian, or United Churches. The Government of Canada built an educational system in which very young children were often forcibly removed from their homes, often taken far away from their communities. Many were inadequately fed, clothed, and housed. All were deprived of the care and nurturing of their parents, grandparents, and communities. First Nations, Inuit, and Métis languages and cultural practices were prohibited in these schools. Tragically, some of these children died while attending residential schools, and others never returned home. The government now recognizes that the consequences of the Indian residential schools policy were profoundly negative, and that this policy has had a lasting and damaging impact on Aboriginal culture, heritage, and language. While some former students have spoken positively about their experiences at residential schools, these stories are far overshadowed by tragic accounts of the emotional, physical, and sexual abuse and neglect of helpless children and their separation from powerless families and communities. The legacy of Indian residential schools has contributed to social problems that continue to exist in many communities today. End quote. So, as a parent, and especially with school starting soon, it is heartbreaking for me to think that my children would have been taken away from our family and be forced to be in a physical and educational environment that we did not agree with. And this would happen again and again, year after year. The children would be taken away from their families, and imagine the long shadow of trauma this would cause for parents and children alike.
So, how do we participate in works of justice as a church? As we have learned from our series, such systemic issues cannot be resolved easily, but it takes intentional effort from each of us to move forward together in the right direction. As a church, we must be willing to repent, listen, and learn together. A huge part of our time in Belakula was actually to sit and listen to our New Hawk friends as they remembered and still continue to process the past and see history and life through their eyes. We must be willing to lay down our own biases, acknowledge what happened, and at times it may even involve us apologizing for the pain that was caused by the church and the systems. Moreover, I believe that any change truly starts with the transformation of our own hearts. Let's pray for our hearts to be filled with compassion and love for our neighbors, all made in the image of God. Let's move away from complacency and move towards imitating the love of Jesus, being his hands and feet in this world. I love the quote by Henry Nouwen on compassion. Compassion asks us to go where it hurts, to enter into the places of pain, to share in brokenness, fear, confusion, and anguish. Compassion challenges us to cry out with those in misery, to mourn with those who are lonely, to weep with those in tears. Compassion requires us to be weak with the weak, vulnerable with the vulnerable, and powerless with the powerless. Compassion means full immersion in the condition of being human. We can also start with the attitude of humility and recognize that even though we may be at the lowest level of the system, if we are silent, we are still a part of the problem. We can stay engaged with the current world events and pray for God to change our attitudes to one that cares. Lastly, we can advocate and speak out for our First Nations brothers and sisters when the opportunities arise in our schools, in our workplace, in our churches, in our social circles. We are all influencers in some way or another, and we can do our part to not let history repeat itself. We can participate by giving greater recognition for the contribution of the First Nations people to Canadian society.
So after Stephen Harper issued the apology to Canadian Indigenous people, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was created, and in 2015 a report was released that has a list of calls to action. Recommendations number 57 and number 62 call for further public education around Aboriginal issues to learn more about the history and contributions of the Aboriginal peoples. Another resource for awareness is Terry LeBlanc, who is a part-time professor at Regent College. He has several videos on YouTube, including one called Understanding Aboriginal Culture, which is a good resource for further education. Third, the UBC Indigenous Foundation is a website with great information, and some of the material in this presentation references that website. Finally, consider talking with First Nations people who may be in your workplace or social circle of acquaintances, if that's an option. Our interactions with First Nations people has been positive, with many people willing to share openly and transparently about the past, and it would be good to understand people's first-hand experiences more.
Lastly, as a church, we can respond in action. We can pray for healing of the First Nation community and for damaging cycles to be broken, such as substance abuse, suicide, teen pregnancies. Next, we can participate in public awareness and community reconciliation events that promote an understanding of shared history. In 2017, our family participated in the Walk for Reconciliation put on by Reconciliation Canada, where 50,000 people gathered in downtown Vancouver. The walk was a call to action, inspiring all Canadians and Indigenous people across Canada to make a shared commitment towards reconciliation and revitalize relationships among Indigenous people and all Canadians. You can also volunteer at organizations that support First Nations communities. There are various organizations in Metro Vancouver. If you would like to be connected with volunteer opportunities, please reach out and we'd be happy to connect you.
So to recap, let's consider a metanoia change in our attitudes, grow in our awareness, and take action to continue to participate in works of justice for the First Nations people in Canada. May God transform our hearts so that we can act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with God.
This concludes our presentation. I want to thank you for your time. May our prayer to God as a church be to break our hearts for what breaks yours. Take some time to reflect on how you will respond, Hope City. Thank you.
Thank you.